Mrs. Huber-Hotz, Switzerland is a land of democracy, of direct democracy, the original democracy, 1291, 1848, the first constitution, then 1874, the amended constitution. The people have extensive rights with the initiative and referendum. Does this system still work today?
The advantage of the Swiss system of direct democracy is certainly that civil society, that's to say, not just the citizens themselves, but also a wide range of different organizations, is directly involved in political life. And that in turn means that political awareness is highly valued. Furthermore, it strengthens political legitimacy more than other political systems. That has given Switzerland immense stability in the last 150 years and made it more secure too. Of course, it also has strengths because Switzerland has developed over the last 150 years. Democracy has spread to include more people than it did in the beginning. But that's also where I can see some disadvantages in a sort of over-democratization, which holds up procedures and fudges responsibilities. Those are certainly the drawbacks of this system of direct democracy.
You've mentioned the drawbacks, the over-democratization. Doesn't that also mean decision-making is inefficient with long, drawn-out, cumbersome bureaucratic proceedings?
I'm not at all sure that our democracy takes longer to reach decisions than other systems do. I think other systems also need time to make people aware of what is at stake when it comes to taking important political decisions. But the fact that many more sections of society are involved in the political process than they are in other countries certainly means that the traditional division of tasks is blurred, so that it is not so clear who is responsible for what.
In the middle of the 19th century, the aim of the fathers of the Constitution was to bring together the different political groups, conservatives and radicals, after the Civil War. This idea of integrating the opposition has proved its worth. Is this still the idea today, to make the opposition part of the system?
For nearly 60 years now, we've had a system in which all political forces take part. In this respect, the system really has achieved very desirable results. But direct democracy is not merely a matter of integrating political forces, but also of including the linguistic, cultural and religious minorities, in parallel to the inclusion of the parties in political life.
There's a lot of talk about the EU constitution. Some countries have already held a referendum on it. Others will do so later. Could or can Switzerland offer development aid, in inverted commas?
It is, of course, very pleasing to see this process underway in the EU. Worldwide, democracy is on the march. In the last 20 years, there have been more popular votes outside Switzerland. Until then, it was Switzerland which had held the most such votes. Now they're happening in other countries too. Switzerland doesn't have a sense of mission about this, but we certainly would be ready to help out with specific instruments to pass on our experience of how to solve questions of democracy.
Direct democracy means popular votes. There are about 4 important popular votes each year in Switzerland, but fewer and fewer citizens are taking part. Has the system come to the end of its useful life? Is there vote fatigue?
Perhaps I should just clarify something here. People often say that voter participation is on the decline, but there has been a change in this trend in Switzerland in the past few years. For about 10 years or so, voter participation has at least been stable, if not rising, at around 45%. In the preceding years, it was different. In the 80s and early 90s, there was indeed a decline in the number of people voting. Participation depends very much on the issues. For important political questions, questions of principle, the people will come out to vote as much as they ever did. But it is naturally the case that the more often votes are held, the less interest citizens feel about them.
You have in your drawer, and probably not right at the bottom, an electronic vote project. Might the opportunity to vote electronically help to combat vote fatigue?
Etwas sein, gegen die Stimmmüdigkeit anzukämpfen.
We're convinced that this could mobilize new sections of our society, particularly, of course, young people. And as people become more mobile, it is also an advantage if they can cast their vote electronically from anywhere in the world, which up until now they have not been able to do. It will be a huge benefit for Swiss citizens who are resident abroad. We have great hopes that voter participation will go up, as also happened when postal voting was introduced. Participation rose again thanks to the availability of postal voting.
In Switzerland, everything's on a small scale. 26 cantons, cantonal parliaments, cantonal authorities, courts, governments. When we now have a Europe without frontiers, is the Swiss system adapted to the modern world?
There is a very concrete question of how to reform our federal system. We are working on it. We have decided on a new division of tasks between the central government and the cantons, a new way of sharing our revenue. But of course, this reform discussion must go further. Switzerland cannot afford to stand still.
Discussions about the EU, giving Switzerland a say in the EU. People here use this to claim that then Switzerland would have to dismantle its direct democracy, and that would mean a democratic deficit. So we cannot get actively involved. If Switzerland does become more actively involved in Europe, do you see a threat here to Swiss democracy?
No, I don't, although we must think about how democracy is to be organized. In recent years, we have extended democratic tools. We have extended the right to referendum on state treaties and created the General Popular Initiative. Should we join the EU, we would have to think about the instruments at our disposal, to concentrate them, to find new ways, perhaps to delegate to cantonal and local level. I prefer to see this as a chance to question and renovate our democracy.
Hinterfragt werden kann und renoviert werden kann.
The EU is revising its constitution. There have already been popular votes in different countries, but even in Switzerland, small as it is, there are cantons which are also in the process of changing their constitutions, for example, Canton Zurich. Does it really make sense for cantons in Switzerland to have their own constitutions in comparison with the immense EU constitution?
I believe that each political authority or political unit should give itself a constitution in order to strengthen its own identity. I think it makes sense to have constitutions. I also think it makes sense that these constitutions should periodically be questioned and adapted for new circumstances and new challenges.
At one point in the 70s and 80s, there was a trend among political scientists when people spoke of condensing democracy. If you now have to condense the field where democracy is applied, where specifically could this be done?
For me, it would be important to question the division of tasks between the central authorities, cantons and communes on the one hand, but also between citizens and the local parliaments and local governments. This is where I see a possibility for concentration, a better allocation and division of tasks, and also of responsibilities.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Huber-Hotz. You won't be running out of work.
My pleasure. In 1990, the Swiss electorate approved a popular initiative calling for a ban or moratorium on the construction of new nuclear power stations until the year 2000. In 1998, the Electricity Without Nuclear Power Association launched a new initiative aimed at extending the moratorium.
The initiative is to ensure that no backsliding in energy politics occurs after the expiry of the moratorium. It extends the freeze on construction of new nuclear power stations for a further 10 years. The Moratorium Plus also bans nuclear power stations from increasing their output with the greater risk that that entails of a nuclear accident.
A second initiative called for the complete abandonment of nuclear energy. Existing facilities would be phased out in stages. At the same time, use of renewable, homegrown energy would be promoted and new jobs created.
We want to bring about a change in energy production. We want to bring in an era of efficient solar energy. There's an enormous employment potential for Switzerland in this sector.
The battle over a new nuclear power station referendum was launched. The energy industry disapproved.
In our view, neither of the initiatives is acceptable. Both are flawed in a political sense because they end the energy consensus and complicate the search for political solutions. Both are flawed from an ecological point of view, because clean nuclear power will either have to be replaced by electricity from gas or oil, or else imported, which will affect tiny Switzerland's autonomy.
The 100,000 signatures needed for each initiative had to be collected within 18 months of the launch. This target was met, and in September 1999, both initiatives were handed in at the Federal Chancellery. The Federal Council rejected both initiatives, which were also given a rough ride in parliamentary discussions. The debates were led by the former administrative director of Kaiser Augst AG nuclear power station.
Although today no one contemplates building a new nuclear power station in Switzerland, we don't want to completely veto the option of renovating a power station or even building a new one. One day, it may be necessary.
Not much has changed in the discussion since the 1980s. The two sides clash again in the National Council. And those who once demonstrated against new nuclear power stations today back the closure of existing facilities. Preventing the construction of Kaiser Augst was and is the nail in the coffin of Switzerland's nuclear industry. It was also the first step on the road out of nuclear power.
The nuclear initiative was thought to have a fair chance of success, and so Parliament also discussed a counter-proposal to the moratorium initiative. The Federal Council wanted to bring about a compromise, and so proposed a ban on the reprocessing of spent fuel. In actual fact, it was our intention to achieve a consensus in energy policy in the area of nuclear power too. The veto on reprocessing could, to a certain extent, have taken the edge off a tense situation.
However, Parliament wanted nothing to do with it and rejected both the veto on reprocessing and the counter-proposal. Both initiatives were thus put to a popular vote without a counter-proposal. Voting on both initiatives was held on May 18, 2003. The battle had already begun months earlier, as shown here at a media conference given by opponents of the two initiatives. The Federal Council also addressed the electorate in a television broadcast.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On the 18th of May 2003, the Swiss electorate will vote on no fewer than 9 proposals. As you see, the people make use of direct democracy and launch initiatives, and then at some point we must vote on them. This evening I shall talk about 3 initiatives, a little hastily and maybe rather briefly, but as you're aware, you can go into more depth on the subject in the referendum booklet and open discussions. Now to the 2 nuclear initiatives. The first is called Electricity Without Nuclear Power. This is a radical phasing out initiative. That is to say, within 10 years we will have to replace almost 40% of our electricity production. I must honestly say that we regard this as impossible, particularly because at the same time there should be no increase in CO2 emissions. This is why both the Federal Council and Parliament clearly recommend voting no to this initiative. Now to the second initiative, called Moratorium Plus. An appealing name, as we have approved a moratorium initiative once already. In reality, this is also a phasing out initiative. That is to say, we shall not be able to build any new nuclear power stations. It will no longer be possible for existing nuclear power stations to increase their output. And should an existing nuclear power station want to operate beyond its 40 years of service life, it will be possible for a referendum to be launched against this.
So soll dagegen ein Referendum möglich sein.
The question is whether such a phasing out is feasible. Technically, it is. Politically, I have my doubts.
Da habe ich meine Zweifel.
We would have to push through a rigorous energy-saving drive, which would mean interfering in canton autonomy. We would have to promote renewable energy, in particular, I would say, geothermal energy. But that has its price. We would have to impose incentive taxes, and that is exactly where I have my doubts as to whether a consensus will later be possible. In my experience, whenever things get down to basics, when money is involved, in the end, parliamentarians and electorate always vote no. The Federal Council therefore recommends that you reject this initiative.
On May 18, 2003, the electorate rejected both initiatives, the moratorium initiative with 58.4% against, the nuclear initiative with 66.3% against. On voting day, Federal Councillor Moritz Leuenberger commented as follows.
I interpret this emphatic double no not just as a yes to nuclear energy, but as a yes to the energy policy of the Federal Council in general.
This would include the prohibition on reprocessing. However, there was certainly another decisive factor dictating the clear rejections.
On the one hand, of course, there have been no recent accidents, and people forget very quickly. But there is also great confidence in their safety and, above all, in our methods of monitoring and organization.
But Moritz Leuenberger also had some consolation in store for the nuclear skeptics. The lifespan of the existing nuclear power stations is limited, and no new nuclear power station is likely to be constructed anytime soon in Switzerland. In the beginning, there was the storm. 1987, mud, rocks and water devastated the canton of Uri. Transit traffic ground to a halt. And suddenly pollution levels in Uri sank below the permitted limits. The environmentally conscious citizens of this mountainous canton decided to make a stand against the environmental pollution generated by the traffic. Shortly after the disaster, they met with like-minded people from the cantons of Valais, Graubünden and Ticino and launched what became known as the Alpine initiative. In May 1990, they submitted the petition with the 110,000 signatures they had collected to the Parliament in Bern. A vote on the Alpine initiative proposals would have to be held.
The Alpine initiative demanded that heavy goods transit traffic must be carried by rail. Although at the start of the 1990s, 80 to 90% of goods passing through Switzerland were transported by rail, a study had shown that without the Alpine initiative, 12,000 trucks would be crossing the Swiss Alps by road every day by the year 2015. If the Alpine initiative were to be accepted, this would mean only 4,500 trucks a day, only those trucks that were loaded or unloaded in Switzerland. The Alpine initiative also demanded that the transfer of this traffic to the railways would have to be implemented within 10 years, and that there should be no further expansion of the transit road system in the Alpine region.
In Uri, where the people are most directly affected by the traffic, almost the entire population supported the Alpine initiative, with a determination that did full credit to the emblem on Uri's flag, the bull. They were attempting to defy not only the rest of Switzerland, but Europe as well.
We deeply regret that the Federal Council and Parliament have passed up the opportunity to make it mandatory for heavy goods traffic, by which I mean European transit traffic, to be transported by rail. The mood of the people in Uri is not good at all at the moment. We know that if it's not made compulsory for heavy goods traffic to be transferred to the railways, that this traffic will remain on the motorway, as the motorway is still the cheapest and most flexible route.
Nach wie vor einfach der billigste Verkehrsträger ist und der, wo der mobilste ist.
And the new rail link through the Alps, won't that ensure that the traffic goes by rail?
With the NEAD, there are no mandatory contractual conditions under the current requirements. The heavy goods traffic won't move over to rail of its own free will.
The Federal Council is of the opinion that the Alpine initiative is no longer necessary because 90% of heavy goods transit traffic is already transported by rail.
It is in fact the case that in 1980 as much as 96% of the heavy goods traffic was transported by rail. But since then, by the start of the 1990s, this has fallen to some 83%. And in recent years, the move to the roads has speeded up. If it goes on like this, by the time the NEAT opens, we'll have around 50% going by rail, and all the rest will be going by road. I want to know how we're supposed to finance and make proper use of the NEAT when more and more of the traffic is moving onto the roads. Will it be the taxpayer who has to foot this bill at the end of the day?
The National Council and Council of States rejected the Alpine initiative. Even the other Alpine cantons withheld their support. The Uri Landrat Parliament, however, offered its backing and formulated a cantonal initiative that was identical in its content. But this too failed to meet with the approval of the federal parliament. The Euro politicians felt as though they had been taken for a ride. They became all the more determined in their support for the Alpine initiative, even though they also knew that its acceptance would hardly make Switzerland's position in Brussels any easier. Doubly affected was Martin Führer, a member of the Uri government living in Schartdorf, between the railway and the motorway. He expressed his views in an interview before the vote. Federal Councillor Oggi says making the transfer of traffic onto the railways mandatory will contravene the terms of the transit agreement with the EU. Doesn't this bother the Uri government?
The initiative does not comply with the transit agreement, that's correct. But the transit agreement is a contract that's due to expire in 12 years' time, and we're of the opinion that the time will come for the compulsory transfer from road to rail to be discussed again.
Doesn't this make Switzerland's position in Europe all the more difficult?
No additional problems due to the Alpine initiative will arise in the next 10 years at any rate. As for how the situation will look in the future, that's difficult to assess at the moment.
The Alpine initiative met with the support of environmental groups. They were of the opinion that the initiative would receive a positive response from broad sections of the European population. And it would serve as a timely reminder to European politicians that they should not forget their fine words about moving heavy goods traffic off the roads. On February 20th, 1994, 51.9% of voters and 13 cantons voted in favour of the Alpine initiative. A decisive contribution to the success of the initiative came from the president of the Uri cantonal government, the Landermann Hans-Rudi Stadler. He spoke with obvious delight to those attending the party. He belongs to the Swiss Christian Democrats. Many of his colleagues in this conservative party could not bring themselves to endorse this initiative publicly.
On the Sunday evening after the announcement of the result of the initiative, the people of Uri celebrated the victory to the full. The celebration in Uri was first and foremost a party for young people.
In my opinion, the big political debates were not the decisive factor in the success of the initiative. What was important was that people saw what was going on in front of them and thought about it and realized that something had to be changed. This is why Hans-Rudi Stadler is all the more pleased by the positive result.
The Alpine initiative is one of the few popular initiatives that has been accepted at the ballot box, only the 12th to be passed since the right to a popular initiative was introduced in 1891. The concerns of the Alpine initiative seem, however, to have persuaded the majority of all Swiss citizens.
Prominent national politicians also made the trip to Uri. Peter Bodenmann, president of the Social Democratic Party, was delighted to join the celebrations.
There are always two ways of looking at a situation. One is from the top looking down, i.e. the opinion of governments, bureaucrats and people in other influential positions. The other is the view of the people who are actually affected. I have the impression that all evening long, only the people from the top have been asked for their opinions. But here the opinion of the people at the bottom is crucial. I think that both in the Tyrol and in France, those directly affected by transit traffic will be encouraged by the result of the vote today to take action and to demand a change of course in transport policy for Europe. And this will have a positive influence on European politics.
Uri celebrated its victory till the early hours of the morning. The London man even took to the dance floor.
Rien, a model town. Pretty, clean, wealthy and fairly unknown until 1997 when Ernst Beyeler built his museum. Then, at his invitation in November 1998, Christo and Jean-Claude presented wrapped trees, putting the town at the centre of the art world for 3 weeks. What was unusual was there was no money involved.
Jean-Claude and Christo achieved something wonderful in Rien. They refused any sponsoring. They took no money. Christo produces drawings which are then sold and which of course have a price tag. The price is set for the whole world. It isn't a special price for Rien.
Art is subjective, gratitude isn't. The municipal authorities recognise the PR value of Christo and Jean-Claude, something for which any advertising agency would have charged millions. The work of art Wrapped Trees that Jean-Claude and Christo produced in Rien at the instigation of Ernst Beyeler, who established the foundation, had such a great impact on the municipality that we decided to recommend buying the picture. This picture is what it's all about.
Most people find the price of 295,000 francs too high, and many are worried about the future financial situation of the commune. And the people are also concerned about the future financing of the commune's much appreciated hospital.
The arguments of the right-wingers against the purchase took many forms. Concern about the money, envy and a small-minded attitude to art. The village itself was strangely unexcited about the whole business.
There was no major public debate. The battle for votes took place mainly in our newspaper through readers' letters.
Were they perhaps a little uncomfortable at the fact that rich Rien was conducting a referendum campaign over a matter of 300,000 francs?
I can imagine that people who were in fact against the purchase of this artwork felt awkward about appearing in public. I believe that, yes.
The municipal government of Rien was overconfident. It failed to conduct a convincing campaign.
You have to take into consideration the fact that the Executive Council made its decision when the trees were still wrapped, and the referendum was called when the trees were no longer wrapped.
Can you put art issues to the public?
Swiss political tradition answers this question with a yes.
What emerged was that very few of the voters in Rien knew clearly what it really meant when they cast their no votes. It was not only that they passed up the chance to thank the artists appropriately, they also handed a victory to right-wingers who saw it as approval for their conventional accounting methods.
2,562 yes, 5,875 no. Rien rejects the proposal.
One last look at the picture and a call to New York.
I and Christo, we are disappointed, but, we understand. Financially, of course, it would have helped us because we spend all our money building our projects. But the Wrapped Trees is one of our most magnificent projects, and Rien will always be in our heart as a part of our life.
Swiss citizens of voting age go to the polls several times a year to decide on various issues. Every 4 years they elect new communal councils and cantonal and federal parliaments. To make the process easier, party lists of the candidates are printed and sent by post to voters. All a voter has to do is tear out the list of candidates he or she prefers and either take it to a polling station or send it by post to the commune authorities.
This is a sheet with voting slips listing the various candidates under the names of their parties. A voter can put the list of his or her preferred candidates in the ballot box as it stands, or can change it. It's possible to strike out the name of any candidate on the list, but the list still counts as going to the particular party. A name and its number can be put in twice in a process called accumulation. But in that case, another name must be struck out in order to prevent a situation arising where more candidates are elected than there are seats. A voter can also write in the name of candidates from other parties on his party list. This is called splitting the ticket, and when that happens, the voter's own party loses votes.
The election office is an elected authority and should consist of representatives from various parties who keep a close eye on each other. That is democratic control. To make sure that the counting and recording of ballots proceed smoothly, there are detailed regulations and many forms, as well as the relevant computer programs. Voting results from the communes are put together in the district, go through the cantonal administration and are then published.
Seats are always allocated on the basis of how well each party did in the election. This is called proportional representation. Let's take an example. 4 parties have campaigned for 9 seats. The election office first counted all ballots cast for the parties. That gives the total number for each party. Here are the results for each party. However, parties B and C announced before the election that they had decided to merge their lists. So next, the votes cast for parties B and C are counted together and treated as if they'd been cast for one party. What's important now is the total number of votes for the parties, 306,000.
Only then are the votes for the individual candidates counted, because the media is interested mainly in the number of seats won by the parties on the basis of their lists. Normally, only electoral officers and a few party strategists know how the seats are precisely allocated.
Each constituency also needs to know the overall total of the votes on the lists. This number is the basis from which a so-called distribution number is calculated. That means dividing the total number of votes by the number of seats available plus 1. Now the total number of votes received by the parties or the merged lists are divided by the distribution number, 30,600. This gives the number of seats won by each party. These are also known as direct mandates. So in our example, all the seats are allocated first time round.
Here, shown by Canton, are the results achieved by the most commonly merged lists in the 1999 elections.
Now a new distribution number is required to allocate the seats between parties B and C, which merged their lists. The total votes won by each party in the list merger divided by the distribution number gives the number of seats. 1 for party B and 3 for party C. This is the final seat allocation in our example.
In the meantime, the votes going to individual candidates are also counted, thus ranking them by popularity. The number of candidates elected is the same as the number of seats the party has won. The next best runners-up take over seats falling vacant if there are any retirements during the life of the Parliament.
Did the merger of the lists of parties B and C benefit them? Let's go over the figures again on the basis that there had been no merger. Party B did not reach the distribution number and won no seats. This result is somewhat different. And we have the usual situation in which not all seats have been allocated at the first go. To allocate the 9th seat, or so-called remaining mandate, a second distribution is needed. The total number of votes for the party divided by the number of seats already won plus 1. The party with the largest quotient wins the remaining mandate. The example shows the nature of the competition between the small and big parties.
Celebrating victory is always sweet after so much expense and hard work during the campaign, and after the votes have been counted and worked out. In proportional representation, it is always the parties as a whole which can or must be regarded as winners or losers.
Election by simple majority, on the other hand, is simpler because this is a matter of candidates running for specific posts, such as the Speaker of Parliament or as a member of the government or federal council. These are elections of individuals. They have nothing to do with how strong the party is, as in proportional representation. They're based solely on a majority vote.
In elections to the Federal Council, when a post becomes vacant, there is always an election by simple majority, in which members of both parliamentary chambers choose government members individually in a secret ballot. The election office of the United Federal Assembly consists of members of the National Council and the Council of States. They count the votes after each round.
Ich gebe Ihnen das Resultat der Wahl bekannt.
Résultat du troisième tour de scrutin.
Es haben Stimmen erhalten.
Ont obtenu des voix.
Frau Ruth Metzler 122.
Madame Ruth Metzler 122.
Frau Rita Roos ebenfalls 122.
Madame Rita Roos 122.
Weil keine der beiden Kandidatinnen das absolute Mehr erhalten hat, findet ein vierter Wahlgang statt bei Stimmengleichheit.
In election by simple majority, the first candidate to achieve an absolute majority, or half the valid votes plus 1, is declared elected. Voting continues until one candidate has achieved this.
Ich erkläre Annahme der Wahl.
A few rounds of voting end up with a Democratic winner and a Democratic loser.
At the end of the 1990s, the Swiss government set about tackling the reform of political rights. These needed to be brought up to date to meet the challenges of the 21st century. An important topic of discussion was the number of signatures required to submit an initiative or referendum. However, parliamentary discussions showed that substantial amendments to political rights were unlikely to find a majority in favour. So the only improvements that could be made were to extend the popular initiative to enable it to propose new laws and to expand the referendum on international treaties. Until the year 2003, only the so-called constitutional initiative existed. In other words, each popular initiative forced an amendment to the federal constitution. For the advocates of reform, this had been long out of date.
Not every issue which has been made the subject of an initiative deserves to be included in the Constitution. For instance, if 100,000 people in Switzerland feel that 4 Sundays should be declared traffic-free, this must be regulated at legislative level and not written into the Constitution.
That is the exact aim of the proposed General Popular Initiative. 100,000 signatures would allow the formulation of a general proposal. Parliament would then decide whether this simply requires new legislation or an amendment of the Constitution. The Conservative No Committee voiced the criticism that this would dilute political rights, saying that a general popular initiative would give Parliament too great an influence over the course of events.
A general popular initiative takes important elements out of the hands of the people and puts them into the hands of Parliament. Whichever way the cantonal majority goes, Parliament takes the final decision on whether a bill has a counter-proposal or not. These are negative points that we must quite clearly fight against.
Just as controversial was the extension of the treaty referendum, the possibility of having the future option of submitting treaties for popular approval.
Where we are dealing with setting the direction of our foreign policy, concluding important agreements and so on, making new commitments, the people should also have their say. I think it's right that our citizens should share in foreign policy making. To some extent, this needs an examination and reorientation of political rights. On the other hand, where we have already made commitments, we cannot do just what we want with our contractual partners, or we will become completely untrustworthy. Here, in my opinion, we must integrate and fit in.
Meaning, in effect, a limitation of citizens' rights?
To a certain extent, but not just of citizens' rights. The same applies to Parliament, the same applies to government. Just as cantons are today tied within the framework of federal law, Switzerland will also, to a certain extent, be a little more tied within the framework of contractual law, to which it will then be subject. All organs, including the people. In the run-up to the vote in February 2003, Ruth Metzler, the federal councillor, appeared on television to explain the reform of political rights and to attempt to get the proposal approved.
Dear Swiss citizens, the whole world knows that here in Switzerland we're able to have a say on what should be changed in our nation. We're extremely proud of our system of direct democracy and this extensive right to voice our opinions. But as with most things in life, direct democracy requires attention and adaptation from time to time because society also changes. On February 9th, US Swiss citizens can vote on such a modernization. An essential element of our direct democracy, namely political rights, is to be improved and adapted to suit the latest developments in our society. Cautious modernization is now necessary for two reasons. Firstly, at a federal level in Switzerland, today we only have initiatives which amend the constitution. Initiators can only propose constitutional and not legislative amendments. This means that constitutional amendments must be demanded for proposals which could actually be dealt with at a legislative level. Many initiators are forced to make use of a constitutional initiative because no political rights exist enabling them to create new laws or to amend or abolish old ones. So voters need a new tool, the General Popular Initiative, under which 100,000 citizens may propose constitutional or legislative changes. These new political rights will replace parts of the former constitutional initiative and of the referenda. Secondly, our national legislation is increasingly being determined by treaties and international law. Legislation is being drawn up more and more at a global level. Today, many legislative provisions on which Parliament must decide serve the implementation of international legislation. Under the current legislation, not all treaties must be put to a referendum. So a referendum can often be brought only against the legislation which faces amendment as the result of a treaty. Now, the electorate will be able to have their say when the course is being set, that is, when a treaty is being concluded. We want to conduct our foreign policy together with our citizens. Dear voters, after the decision on the new federal constitution in 1999 and on justice reform in 2000. We are again faced with another fundamental decision on our state institutions. Parliament is now putting before you a rational reform package which will strengthen our system of direct democracy. The Federal Council and Parliament recommend acceptance of these amendments to political rights.
On the 9th of February 2003, the Swiss electorate approved the reform of political rights with 70% in favour. Federal Councillor Ruth Metzler was overjoyed at the result.
The result of the vote shows quite clearly that the occasionally differing arguments of the opponents didn't manage to convince, and above all, that they didn't manage to mobilise people. That's also proof of a certain trust in the Federal Council and Parliament.
The victors were the political centre, and Federal Councillor Metzler was very pleased.
We need these political powers which will help Switzerland to advance. Perhaps in small steps such as here, but for me the result of today's vote shows quite clearly that our country is not inflexible when it comes to reform.
A vote on citizens' political rights which took place almost without the participation of the citizens, a turnout of only 29%. Were the proposals too lightweight?
People who really want to fulfill their democratic duty, who want to use this opportunity, will do it even when 9 proposals are put to the vote, as are lined up for May 2003. Certainly one reason for this low turnout is that the proposals were lacking in emotional impact.
So this vote was an exception, not a crisis of democracy. With the next vote on a hefty 9 proposals, interest was already again on the increase. In the game of chess, the Queen is not just the most important piece along with the King. No, she's the most powerful of them all. For a long time, however, the members of the Swiss Confederation did not let the Queen have a look in on the political chessboard. The road to political equality for women and men in Switzerland was slow-moving. It took decades, before in 1971 the majority of the exclusively male Swiss electorate decided that women should have the right to vote. The first proposals on the introduction of the right to vote for women were put before Parliament back in 1918. But for the next 40 years, these proposals were repeatedly shelved by the Federal Council and Parliament. It was only in 1959 that the first vote took place, but the all-male electorate rejected the introduction of the right of women to vote and stand for election, with 67% of them voting against.
In 1969, 10 years after the first referendum, women demonstrated outside the parliament in Bern. The women had had enough of the men who perpetually said no, who had continually denied them a crucial civil right. It was the first time that the otherwise all-too-silent women's movement had made itself heard and registered their disenchantment with Swiss men. The demonstration had its effect. The right of women to vote and stand for election was debated once again in Parliament a few days later. No longer would women have to enter the room through a back door. And no longer would men alone have the right to a place on the platform.
The step towards universal adult suffrage must be taken today, because it is essential to achieve justice for women and show respect for their dignity. In any case, there is no difficulty about taking this step today, as the Swiss woman has proved that she deserves to be trusted.
1971, the right of women to vote and be elected is adopted at federal level. As early as the late autumn of the same year, the first female parliamentarians entered the Parliament building. 10 members of the National Council and 1 member of the Council of States. Naturally, they had no time to rest on their laurels. The work in Parliament began immediately. In the early days, the women devoted their attention mainly to social issues. At the time, pregnancy and abortion had occupied Parliament for a number of years.
Wenn Ihnen die Möglichkeiten für die Austragung der Schwangerschaft oder soziale und wirtschaftliche Unterstützung geboten werden, bin ich überzeugt, dass sie sich mehrheitlich zum Vornherein nicht gegen das Kind entscheiden wird.
A highlight of the Year of the Woman in 1975 was the 4th Swiss Women's Congress in Bern on the subject of partnership.
Nun ist es aber so, dass wir schließlich nur den Maßstab des Mannes haben, weil von hier seit Tausenden von Jahren den Frauen gesagt hat, was sie zu denken haben, was sie zu sein haben, wie sie zu sein haben und so weiter.
The women discussed important issues and launched 2 resolutions: the initiative Equal Rights for Men and Women and the establishment of a public body to deal with women's issues. But the Congress was taken over by the new women's movement. They were everywhere, rebellious and demonstrative, making a major contribution to a level of publicity for women that they'd never had before.
Die Sitzung ist eröffnet. La séance est ouverte.
In 1977, Elisabeth Blunchy became the highest-ranking person in Switzerland. The people from Canton Schwyz were proud to be able to welcome the first female president of the National Council. In 1981, a further milestone was reached. The people approved an article in the Constitution that guaranteed equality. From now on, men and women would have equal rights. And what's more, women would have the right to the same pay as men for doing the same work. And yet, until 1983, no women had been elected to the Swiss government, the Federal Council. When Willy Richard stood down, he expressed the wish that a woman should be his successor.
Over the years, since women have had the right to vote, it has become apparent that women have answers to many questions that men simply would not think of. And that is why I would welcome the opportunity for a woman's voice to be heard in the Federal Council.
The December session of the same year saw a woman, Lilian Uchtenhagen, stand for election to the Federal Council for the first time.
Absolutes Mehr 123.
Est élu Monsieur Otto Stich par 124 voix.
Herr Stich ist gewählt mit 124 Stimmen.
But once again, it was a man who was elected to the post. 1 year later, though, in 1984, the time had come. Elisabeth Kopp became Switzerland's first female federal councillor. The constitutional article guaranteeing equality resulted in a need for the law on marriage to be amended. Although Parliament was quick to approve the bill, many men and women were unable to come to terms with the proposals. They called for a referendum.
We don't believe that the Swiss people will accept this law, which is anti-marriage and anti-family, and which will turn marriage and the family upside down.
Nevertheless, the new law on marriage proposed by Parliament won the day.
Wer dem Landsgemeinsplus nicht zustimmen will, der bezieht's mit der Hand.
By 1990, only the women of the canton of Inner Rhodes were still without the right to vote or to stand for election at cantonal level. It took a ruling from the Swiss Federal Supreme Court to knock the men of Appenzell off their pedestal. Enough was enough. Finally, 19 years after the right to vote was granted at federal level, the last bastion of the male domination fell, and all the women of Appenzell were given the right to vote on cantonal matters. Spring 2004 and campaigning started for the tax package. For the right-wing parties in Parliament, it was a prestige project. Économie Suisse, the organisation representing Swiss businesses, allocated several million francs to the campaign. On the opposing side, there were no fewer than 4 different committees. The counter-campaign was launched by the Conference of Cantonal Governments. This is the poster they used.
So far, the cantons have put aside a total of about 2.1 million Swiss francs for the whole campaign. 1 million or so of this comes directly from the cantons and communes. That's on the low side for a national campaign, but I believe it will be enough.
Economy Suisse would not tell journalists how much money it had put into the campaign. This was a taboo subject for the organisation. They were not prepared to be interviewed about it. They were more forthcoming in February. At that time, they were at least prepared to respond, however evasively, to estimates of 10 to 15 million.
That's putting it rather high, but we will commit ourselves sufficiently to ensure a yes vote when voters go to the polls.
No matter what the cost?
We'll see. We must also watch to see how the campaign develops. We're certainly prepared to put a lot into it.
In order to put an end to such secretiveness, Andreas Gross has come out with an initiative calling for more transparency. In future, the committees should make public the figures and the names of donors.
I'm not saying that money rules, nor am I saying that votes can be bought, but money is an important factor, and it's also an important factor in shaping opinion. If people know who's giving money to whom, it'll be easier for them to make up their minds.
The Nuclear Power Initiative in 2003, for example. It is estimated that Economy Suisse and the nuclear lobby spent 15 million francs on this campaign too, but again, there were no precise figures. It was just the same in 1998 with the Initiative Against Genetic Manipulation. Experts calculated that the business and genetic lobby spent 30 to 40 million francs on the No campaign. Supporters had 5 million and the initiative failed.
But the most expensive battle so far was for the 1992 vote on whether to join the European Economic Area. No other campaign since then has swallowed so much money. The estimated costs of both sides, 50 million francs.
No one is against greater transparency, but some claim that publication of all the names and figures is unfeasible and counterproductive.
I'm not opposed to transparency, and if someone gives money, he should be able to do so. But if there's an obligation to declare donations, the effect will be that no one will be prepared to give, and that will make proper campaigns impossible. Then you have to ask how the public's going to form its opinion. Just through the official government booklet and radio programs?
The subject was on the agenda for the 2004 spring session, but was postponed indefinitely. The town clerk and the chief polling officer of Thun arrived to conduct a recount of votes. After the count a few days earlier, the 13,600 original ballot papers were placed in boxes and officially sealed. Now the seals must be broken and the votes recounted since the result was so close. The people of Thun didn't even wait for the government in Bern to order them to do it.
Democracy is much too important to allow any suspicion or rumours suggesting that something went wrong. We have to stop this before it even starts.
Now every single paper will be counted by hand. On voting day itself, technical aids were used to help. In future, a permit will have to be sought for such things. What exactly does this mean?
Technical aids include pencils, erasers, simple calculators, machines for counting banknotes, or computers, which are used in parliamentary elections. I'll prepare the application, and the council will submit it to the federal chancellery. And then we'll wait and see if we get a permit.
The use of scales is the most controversial issue. Even today, the tellers do not want to give them up. First, the instrument is officially calibrated against 100 voting papers.
Jetzt auf die Referenz drücken. Jetzt ist das geeicht als 100 Stück, oder? Jetzt sehen wir, das sollten 10 Bigeli sein, die da kreuzbigelt sind, oder?
On voting day, none of the papers were counted. They were simply weighed. Today, the scales are being used only to check the manual count.
This bundle was put in as a bundle of 100. As a check, it was re-weighed, and the scale showed 101, which was confirmed by a subsequent manual count. People aren't perfect, they keep making mistakes, but the scales won't make mistakes if they're used correctly and have been calibrated.
It is only the scales which convince the tellers in Thun that the count is correct. But the aid used most commonly in Switzerland is the counting machine. The rules have recently changed. For these two, Bern has to issue a permit. If no permit had been obtained, there must now be a manual recount. One canton in 3 is affected.
We've never had a mistake. These machines are foolproof. We run the papers through the machine twice in order to get confirmation. Similar machines are used in banks. They're foolproof. Otherwise, customers would be given too much money. It's a formality. It all depended on having a permit whether you were allowed to use aids or not. Having to start counting by hand again is going back to the Dark Ages, and we won't be able to announce the results until the next day.
In turn, it's beginning to get exciting. We still don't know whether man and machine counted correctly on Sunday. Mr. Stalder, has it all been correct so far?
I'm afraid it hasn't. I had a bundle of no yes papers, where 7 papers with 2 no's had slipped in.
It soon becomes clear how such errors affect the result.
Aha, ja, 3, 500, 700, 3, 739.
Can someone come and check if I'm counting correctly with this forbidden aid?
The result? There's a difference of 116 votes between the 2 counts. That's more than anyone expected.
Now it must be decided whether there has to be a third count. But perhaps a bundle of 100 was put on the wrong side today.
The suspicion turns out to be correct. The error occurred not on Sunday, but today. So what exactly happened?
Here we have a pile of 500 no-yes votes, and here we have a pile of 100 yes-no votes, which have slipped among them. So it looks as if we've accounted for the discrepancy. Now we will add them up again and see what the result is.
Now there are only 11 votes between the 2 counts. Thun rejected the initiative by a fractionally larger majority than previously thought.
I'm convinced that if we were to count yet again, we'd still have a discrepancy of 2 to 3 votes.
And now you send a messenger to carry this news to Bern?
Today we do this with forbidden, or perhaps I should say non-approved aids. First a phone call and then a fax.
The result of the recount in Thun could be food for thought. Projected for the whole country, it would mean an error of more than 5,000 votes, more than enough to tilt a tight result.
I think the referendum is basically a good institution, or a good instrument to be more precise, a good instrument for democracy. The referendum, the right to a popular initiative, the right to freely express one's views, these are all very good.
In my opinion, the referendum is a good thing.
Democratic rights, that's to say the initiative and the referendum, are 2 instruments that are especially popular in the Swiss democracy. Nevertheless, the question arises of whether these democratic rights have not become rather outdated. In 1993, the Federal Council wrote that the number of popular initiatives and referendums had increased to such an extent in the previous few years that the government and parliament could hardly keep up.
In a 5-year period, the electorate votes on about 50 federal bills, and Parliament has to deal with dozens of popular initiatives and referendums. Is Switzerland in danger of collapsing under the burden of democratic rights? In the view of Sylvia Borner, Professor of Economics at the University of Basel and author of a book on the reform of democratic rights, such rights should have their limits.
The exercise of this right has become too easy. Not for ordinary individuals, but rather for those who organize these popular votes or petitions, for organized special interest groups. A second criticism is, moreover, that a form of tyranny has arisen, because we've made something of a myth of democratic rights, namely the myth that the people are permitted to do anything. The people are supposed to hold the supreme power and stand above the law, above international obligations, above the constitutional rights of the individual. And that is, of course, a dangerous illusion, an enormous risk.
What do you think of democratic rights in Switzerland?
They're perfect. I firmly believe that we'll inevitably have to learn the slow and painful lesson, in particular in our relations with Europe, but also in our overall foreign policy, that we'll no longer be taken seriously at the negotiating table if everything we've agreed is thrown out of the window 5 minutes later. But in actual fact, even in our domestic affairs, matters are seriously jammed and blocked.
Do the people have enough power in Switzerland?
Yes, it's just that everything moves a bit more slowly in our country, but we have the right to have our say, that's correct. I'm not against so-called democratic rights, which is in any case a rather dangerous term, as all rights belong to the individual, in my opinion. In reality, the people as a single entity does not have any rights.
What is the most important instrument in the Swiss democracy? We are, the people.
Democratic rights have also been a regular topic of parliamentary debate, as the parliament must either express its opinion on each popular initiative or may declare the initiative to be invalid.
Popular initiatives can be declared invalid if they fail to comply with either mandatory provisions of international law or with the principle of unity of subject matter. Parliament now appears to be pursuing a stricter policy.
You may be given the impression that things are getting a little stricter. Here I'd like, however, to say that democratic rights are a matter very close to our hearts, and we believe democratic rights are a defining characteristic of the Swiss Confederation. I don't think that anyone can tamper with them. Another thing is that certain limits on the initiative, above all those that are formally contained in the Constitution itself, will be applied rather more strictly in the future. This way, it's intended to ensure more compliance with the Constitution in the terms decided on by the people in the cantons.
Don't you have the feeling that Parliament is showing signs of fatigue in relation to democratic rights and is pursuing a policy of fear, particularly in the case of referendums?
That's conceivable, and some decisions point in that direction. But this has to be considered against the background of a boom in the number of popular initiatives and a multitude of referendums. I'd say that democratic rights are currently very much on the rise.
The number of signatures required should be increased because there are too many referendums and popular initiatives.
Anyone who's ever collected signatures will know that this is not the case. It's very difficult and the people are highly skeptical. Well, that's my view. Secondly, one should perhaps distinguish between whether the people think that there are too many proposals to be voted on at each ballot, or whether there are too many proposals full stop. Often they only mean the former. The people know that the number of the popular initiatives and referendums must be compared with the temperature on a thermometer. If society has problems, if certain issues go unresolved, then we see more proposals from minorities. A popular initiative is after all a question posed by a small number of people to the population as a whole.
Which is the most effective instrument in Swiss democracy?
Well, that everyone still has the freedom to speak out and to write, and above all, the right to vote. Our democratic rights are in good health. The fact that they're being used shows clearly how sensible, useful and essential they are. But it may be the case that Parliament has some difficulty dealing with them. It's lost its composure because it feels under siege from the many people who are active.
You say democratic rights are in a healthy condition, but aren't they rather outdated in present-day society?
Quite the contrary. They're one of the most modern things that Switzerland has, as each citizen has the right to have a say, and the legitimacy of the state is based on obtaining majorities every 3 months. And that's very modern, because the citizens are taken seriously. Direct democracy is a permanent declaration of love made to all the people. In Switzerland, there's true democracy, with a few faults, of course. Just like a beautiful woman, she'll always have her minor flaws. Or like my waffles, sometimes they're a bit overdone. I see democracy in Switzerland in much the same way.
So sehe ich die Demokratie in der Schweiz. Un petit show libre de toute interprétation.
In the heart of Brussels, the Swiss mission's location is perhaps symbolic of Switzerland's position in Europe, geographically at the centre but politically very much apart from the EU institutions. Yet despite being the political outsiders, the Swiss are offering Europeans some advice on how citizens should be given a greater voice on major political issues.
It's giving really a group of people the possibility to set the agenda, and that's something very new. Until now, the European Commission has had their own role or own priority to make initiatives, and that's one of the big deficits today.
The Swiss argue that a key part of democratisation starts with giving all EU citizens the right to approve or reject the new EU constitution. While the process is underway, not all countries have opted for a referendum.
Together with a French Euro MP and a German constitutional specialist, Swiss referendum expert Bruno Kaufmann has published a handbook on how to bring EU institutions closer to the people. Included in the new EU constitution is the so-called Citizens' Initiative, under which citizens may demand action on certain issues by the European Commission. This needs to be signed by at least 1 million people in several EU states.
But can Switzerland, population 7 million, export its model to an enlarged European Union with its 540 million citizens? The Swiss ambassador in Brussels often hosts seminars debating that and other referendum-related questions.
Of course, it cannot be translated into the European system as it is, but it is a good example which permits people to have their say in deciding what they want to do in their future.
Clearly, Switzerland has a long history of using direct democracy, referendums, citizens' initiatives, and therefore if you want to look at a model, what better one for the European Union to take some lessons from.
But having said that, the Swiss themselves admit their model has elements that should not be emulated, such as no financial referendums on a national level.
They have no requirements for a fair distribution of money, for instance. They have no requirements like the Californians have where the money comes from.
Ironically, Switzerland's instruments of direct democracy have also led to its citizens mostly rejecting closer ties with the EU, despite the government's pro-Brussels stance. So it may be seen as a double-edged sword, but one which experts say must be at the hands of all EU citizens with regards to crucial EU matters.
E-voting, as the authorities in the Swiss city of Geneva see it. Quick and easy. It can be done anytime, anywhere. Introducing e-voting in Switzerland could encourage more young voters to turn out and make it easier for the 600,000 Swiss living abroad to participate.
Up for vote this time was whether the city of Carouge should buy a local cinema. Voters said yes, by post, at the polling booth, or, for the first time, online. And although e-voting itself didn't do much for voter turnout, which stood at 44%, the project was deemed a success.
It was a great success, as 1/4 of the electorate decided to vote online. At the same time, it's a historic premiere. Carouge, with its 18,000 inhabitants, is now the first city in continental Europe to have tested and carried out e-voting.
The cyber ballots contained a number of security features to ensure they were used correctly. Those who had trouble voting via the internet could call a helpline.
5% of the people casting their ballots said they did so in person because they liked the social contact. And e-voting would not replace polling booths, just provide another way of casting a vote. Meanwhile, pilot projects in various parts of Switzerland will continue, but e-voting on a nationwide scale is still a long way off.